The dust hung in the air like a copper veil as the sun began its descent over the Jabal al-Ansariya mountains. Commander Khalid ibn Rashid stood at the edge of the cliff, his weathered hands gripping the hilt of his father's scimitar. Below him, stretched across the valley floor like a serpent of steel and flesh, marched 5,000 Crusader soldiers. "They come like locusts," whispered Tariq, his second in command, a man whose face bore the scars of a dozen battles. His voice carried the weight of resignation, but his eyes still burned with defiance. Khalid's eyes narrowed as he studied the approaching army. He had been a soldier for 20 years, had fought in the scorching deserts of Egypt and the frozen passes of Anatolia. He had seen empires rise and fall, witnessed the clash of civilizations on blood-soaked fields. But he had never seen odds like these. Behind him, camped in the narrow mountain pass known as Wadi al-Khawf, the Valley of Fear, as locals had called it for centuries, was barely wide enough for 20 men to march abreast. Its walls rose 300 feet on either side, jagged limestone clefts that had been carved by ancient rivers over millennia. Khalid had grown up in these mountains. As a boy, he had climbed every peak, explored every cave, learned the secret paths that only shepherds and smugglers knew. His father had taught him that a wise warrior chooses his battlefield as carefully as he chooses his weapon. As night fell and stars emerged like diamonds scattered across black velvet, Khalid gathered his commanders around a small fire. The flames cast dancing shadows across their faces, making them look like jinn plotting in the darkness. He unrolled a crude map drawn on goatskin, its surface marked with years of careful observation. "They will reach the valley entrance at dawn," he said, marking the location with a piece of charcoal, his movements precise and deliberate. "They are tired from their march through the lowlands, their supply wagons are slow and cumbersome on mountain paths, and they are arrogant, drunk on their recent victories, believing themselves invincible." He looked each man in the eye, ensuring they understood not just the plan, but the stakes. "We will make them bleed for every inch of this valley. We will use the rocks, the heights, the narrow paths, the very earth itself as our weapon. And when they realize they have walked into a trap, when they understand that their numbers mean nothing in this terrain, it will be too late." Old Ahmed, a grizzlied veteran who had fought in the Third Crusade, spoke up. "And if they don't enter the valley, if they go around?" Khalid smiled grimly. "The alternate routes add 2 weeks to their march. Their supplies won't last. They'll enter the valley because they must, because their pride won't allow them to believe that 1,000 men could threaten 5,000. As the commanders dispersed to brief their units, Khalid remained by the fire. He pulled out a small piece of parchment, reading by firelight the letter his daughter Salma had written him before he left. Her childish script described her studies, her dreams of becoming a physician like the great Ibn Sina. He folded it carefully and tucked it back into his tunic over his heart. Tomorrow he would fight to ensure she had a future where such dreams were possible. Baron Geoffrey de Montclair sat astride his massive black destrier, a war horse bred for size and aggression. His ornate helmet, decorated with gold filigree and topped with red plumes, reflected the first rays of sunlight breaking over the eastern peaks. Around him, his knights adjusted their armor, the metallic sounds echoing off the valley walls like the rattling of chains. The morning air was cool, almost pleasant, carrying the scent of sage and mountain thyme. "My lord," said Sir Raymond, his chief scout and one of the few men whose counsel Geoffrey occasionally heeded, "the pass ahead narrows considerably. The locals call it the Valley of Fear. Perhaps we should send advance units to secure the heights before committing the main force." "We are 5,000 strong," Geoffrey interrupted, his voice dripping with contempt and the absolute certainty of a man who had never truly been tested. "Knights of the Cross, blessed by the Pope himself. What would you have me fear? A handful of desert rats hiding in caves? Peasants with bows?" Raymond fell silent, though his jaw tightened. He had learned not to question the Baron's confidence too openly, though something in his gut, the instinct that had kept him alive through a dozen campaigns, told him this valley felt wrong. Too quiet, too still. No birds sang, no animals moved in the scrub brush. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath. As the Crusader vanguard entered Wadi al-Khawf, their banners streaming in the morning breeze, Khalid watched from a hidden position 200 feet above. He lay flat on a rocky outcrop, his body invisible against the stone, his breathing slow and controlled. Around him, positioned along both cliff faces in carefully prepared positions, his archers waited. They had spent the previous day rubbing ash into their clothing, making themselves part of the rock itself. Below, concealed behind boulders and in shallow caves barely large enough for a man to crouch, his infantry waited with oil pots and ropes tied to loosened stones. "Patience," whispered Khalid to Tariq beside him, though he spoke as much to himself as to his friend. "Let them commit fully to the pass. Let their arrogance be complete." An hour passed, then 2. The sun climbed higher, and the valley floor began to shimmer with heat. The Crusader columns stretched like a steel river through the valley, their armor glinting, their voices echoing off stone walls as officers shouted orders. Geoffrey himself was now deep within the pass, surrounded by his elite knights, the most heavily armored and experienced warriors in his force. Behind them came the supply wagons, creaking and groaning over the rocky ground. Khalid's hand rose slowly, his fingers spread wide against the blue sky. Every eye was on him. Time seemed to slow. A hawk circled overhead, its cry sharp in the still air. Then his hand dropped like a falling stone. The valley exploded into chaos. Arrows rained down from impossible angles, not in the wild volleys of panicked soldiers, but in precise, measured shots that found gaps in armor, struck horses in their vulnerable necks, created cascading confusion. Crusader soldiers stumbled and fell. Horses screamed and reared, throwing their riders. The disciplined column began to fragment. Then came the rocks, boulders that had been carefully loosened over the previous night, held in place by ropes and wooden wedges, began to cascade down the cliff faces. They struck with thunderous impacts, crushing armor and bone, but more importantly, blocking the pass at both ends. The army was trapped, divided into segments, unable to support each other. Geoffrey's voice boomed over the chaos, a lion's roar trying to restore order. "Shields up! Archers, return fire! Infantry, hold formation!" But there was nothing to return fire at. The Muslim soldiers were shadows, ghosts that appeared just long enough to loose an arrow or hurl a spear before vanishing among the rocks. When groups of Crusader soldiers tried to climb the cliffs to engage them, they found the paths treacherous and narrow, perfect for ambush. Men in heavy armor discovered that every step upward was exhausting in the thin mountain air. "This is madness," Sir Raymond shouted, his horse wheeling beneath him as arrows clattered off his shield. "We must retreat, reform outside the valley." "We do not retreat," Geoffrey roared, his face purple with rage and humiliation. "We are knights of Christendom. We will crush these—" An arrow took him in the shoulder, slipping through the gap between his breastplate and pauldron. He grunted, grabbed the shaft with his mailed fist, and snapped it off, leaving the head buried in his flesh. Blood seeped through the steel, but he continued shouting orders, refusing to show weakness. By midday, the situation had become desperate. The Crusader army was divided into 4 separate groups, unable to advance or retreat, unable to bring their superior numbers to bear.
Their supply of water, carried in heavy barrels on wagons, was cut off in the rear sections. Under the merciless sun, men began to suffer from thirst. The wounded cried out for water that couldn't reach them. And in the heights above, Khalid's 1,000 men, though exhausted and running low on arrows, prepared for the long night ahead. They had hurt the giant, but they had not killed it. The real test was still to come.
Darkness brought no relief to the Crusaders. If anything, it brought something worse than death: terror without form, fear without face. Khalid's men knew these mountains in ways the Europeans never could, in ways that went beyond mere familiarity. They knew which stones would ring hollow when struck, creating echoes that made one man sound like 10. They knew paths so narrow that only someone who had traveled them 100 times could navigate them in darkness. They knew where the wind funneled through gaps in the rock, creating moaning sounds that froze the blood. They moved through the night like spirits, rolling stones down on sleeping soldiers, firing arrows at campfires from angles that seemed impossible, creating the constant impression of being surrounded by thousands. It was psychological warfare of the most effective kind. Young Thomas, a squire from Normandy who had joined the crusade seeking glory and adventure, huddled behind his shield as rocks clattered around his position. He had not slept in 30 hours. His eyes burned with exhaustion. His hands shook uncontrollably. Neither he nor anyone else in his unit had managed more than a few minutes of fitful rest. "How many are there?" he whispered to the knight beside him, Sir William, a veteran of the Second Crusade, who had fought at the siege of Damascus. "I don't know, boy. Could be 100, could be 10,000. In this cursed place you can't tell. The mountains themselves seem to fight against us." What Thomas couldn't know was that the same 50 archers were rotating positions along carefully planned routes, creating the illusion of overwhelming numbers. What Geoffrey couldn't know, as he sat in his command tent with maps spread before him and his shoulder throbbing with infection, was that Khalid's supplies were just as limited, his men just as exhausted, just as frightened. But Khalid had one critical advantage that transcended logistics or tactics. His men were fighting for their homes, their families, their very existence. Every arrow counted because they had no more to waste. Every stone mattered because it might be the one that saved their children. They fought with the desperate clarity of men who had everything to lose. At midnight, as the moon rose full and bright, Khalid made his boldest move. He sent 200 men, a fifth of his entire force, down narrow paths known only to smugglers and mountain goats. They carried clay pots filled with oil, strips of cloth for torches, and flint for striking sparks. Their mission was simple but terrifyingly dangerous: reach the valley floor undetected and destroy the Crusader supply train. They moved in absolute silence, their feet wrapped in cloth, their weapons tied down to prevent clanking. It took them 2 hours to descend what should have been a 10-minute walk. One man slipped and fell, his scream cut short as he tumbled into darkness. The others didn't pause. They couldn't afford to. When they reached the valley floor, they found the supply wagons corralled in a defensive circle, guarded by exhausted soldiers who were more focused on the cliffs above than threats from their own level. The Muslim fighters crept forward like shadows, poured oil over wagons, and then, at a signal, lit their torches. The explosion of flames lit up the valley like a false dawn. Food, water, medical supplies, siege equipment, spare weapons, all consumed by fire. The flames roared 30 feet high, creating a backdraft that could be felt hundreds of yards away. Geoffrey watched his campaign burn, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached, his fists pounding against the table in his tent until they bled. "Tomorrow," he said to Raymond, his voice like gravel, "we break through.
Whatever the cost, we cannot stay here another night. Order the men to prepare for a dawn assault. Every able-bodied soldier advances north. We leave the wounded, we leave the dead, we leave everything that slows us down. We break through, or we die trying." Raymond nodded grimly. They both knew what this meant. It would be a slaughter. But staying meant slow death from thirst and starvation, picked apart piece by piece by an enemy they couldn't even see to fight.
Geoffrey had reorganized his forces overnight through sheer force of will. He would sacrifice half his army as a vanguard, 2,500 men thrown against the northern barricade in successive waves, while his elite units, the knights and heavily armored infantry, fought their way south. It was brutal mathematics, the calculus of desperation, but he saw no other option. His reputation, his honor, his very life depended on breaking free of this cursed valley. "For God and glory! For the cross and crown!" he shouted as the first wave charged forward, his voice hoarse, but still powerful enough to echo off the cliffs. They met a wall of death. Khalid had spent the night repositioning his forces, pulling men from less critical positions and concentrating them at the two exit points. He knew Geoffrey would have to attack. Staying in the valley meant death. Now, as exhausted Crusaders charged uphill over loose rock, their armor weighing them down, their breath coming in ragged gasps in the thin air, they faced not scattered guerrilla fighters, but a disciplined defensive line. The Muslim soldiers had constructed crude barricades from the same rocks they'd used as weapons. Behind these barriers, they stood shoulder to shoulder, spears braced, swords ready. They were outnumbered 5-1 at this point of contact, but they held the high ground and they fought with the fury of desperation. Tariq himself stood at the northern barricade, his wounded leg bound tight, his sword rising and falling like a scythe through wheat. "For Al-Qamar!" he roared, his voice cracking with strain. "For our children, for our future!" The Crusaders came in waves, each more desperate than the last. The first wave broke against the shield wall like water against stone, leaving bodies piled 3 deep at the base of the barricade. The second wave climbed over the corpses of the first, using their dead comrades as stepping stones, and pushed the defenders back 10 feet before a furious counterattack drove them back down. The third wave nearly broke through, their sheer momentum and weight of numbers overwhelming one section of the line, before reserves rushed in to plug the gap. Men fought hand to hand, so close they could smell each other's breath, see the fear in each other's eyes. Swords rose and fell, blood ran down the rocks, making footing treacherous. The wounded crawled backward, trying to escape the trampling feet. The dead were pushed aside to make room for more dying. Geoffrey led the fourth wave himself, his wounded shoulder bleeding through fresh bandages, his face pale from blood loss, but his eyes burning with manic determination. He fought like a demon possessed, his sword cutting down 3 men in as many seconds, his strength seemingly inhuman. His knights rallied around him, forming a wedge that drove deep into the Muslim lines. And then Khalid himself appeared before him, materializing from the chaos like fate made flesh. The two commanders circled each other amid the carnage, a small circle of calm forming around them as men on both sides paused to watch. Geoffrey, massive and armored like a moving fortress, his sword still slick with blood. Khalid, lighter, faster, his movements economical and precise, reading his opponent's movements like a scholar reading a text. Their swords met once with a shower of sparks, twice, the impact jarring up both men's arms, 3 times, each testing each other's strength and skill. They were evenly matched, both masters of their craft, both fighting for something greater than themselves. Then Khalid did something Geoffrey didn't expect. He stepped back and lowered his sword, though he kept it ready to parry. "Baron," he called out in accented but clear French, his voice cutting through the sounds of battle. "Your men are dying for a city you cannot take. My men are dying to protect their families. You are a warrior of honor.
I have heard this about you, even if I have also heard of your cruelty. Is there no honor in ending this, in choosing life over pride?" Geoffrey's eyes widened behind his helmet. In 2 decades of warfare across 3 continents, no Muslim commander had ever offered him terms. They had fought to the death, had surrendered unconditionally, had fled before him, but none had stood before him as an equal and proposed negotiation. "What do you propose?" he asked, breathing heavily, his wounded shoulder screaming with pain. "Safe passage south," Khalid said, aware that every man on both sides was listening. "Your army leaves intact, but leaves the valley. You take your wounded, your supplies, your honor. Al-Qamar is spared. You are spared. We all see another sunrise. In 3 months, you can resupply and campaign elsewhere. But this valley, this place, this battle, it ends now." For a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Geoffrey was silent. Around him, his knights waited for his decision. Above him, Muslim archers had their arrows nocked but not drawn, the tension in their bowstrings matching the tension in the air. The entire battle had paused, balanced on the edge of a knife, history pivoting on a single choice. Geoffrey thought of the men he had lost, perhaps 2,000 dead or too wounded to march. He thought of the impossible terrain, of the fact that even if he won through this pass, his army would be too broken to take a defended city. He thought of his wife in Normandy, of the son he'd never met, now 3 years old. He thought of how history would remember him, as the baron who lost 5,000 against 1,000, or as the tactician who knew when to preserve his force. "You have terms," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. A collective exhale seemed to pass through both armies, tension releasing, like a drawn bow slowly loosened.
As the last of the Crusader army filed out of the southern end of the valley, their banners torn and bloodied, their wounded carried on makeshift stretchers, Khalid stood with his remaining men and watched them go. They had won. Against impossible odds, against one of the most feared commanders in Christendom, they had won. But victory tasted like ash in his mouth, bitter and dry. He walked among his soldiers, personally counting the cost as a commander must. 273 men would never return home. Their bodies lay covered with cloaks on the valley floor, waiting for burial rites. Another 100 were wounded so badly they might not survive the week. Many more bore injuries that would mark them for life, missing fingers, scarred faces, limps that would never heal. Tariq sat against a rock, a physician wrapping a fresh bandage around his leg wound, his face pale from blood loss, but his eyes still fierce. "We held them," he said, managing a weak smile. "When our grandchildren ask if we were brave, we can say yes." "We did," Khalid replied, kneeling beside his friend, "and Al-Qamar is safe. Your daughters will grow up in peace." That night, as fires burned across the valley, cooking fires now, not war fires, Khalid walked among the wounded, speaking with each man, hearing their stories. There was Hassan, barely 18, who had killed his first man and wept afterward. There was old Ahmad, who had taken an arrow through the hand and joked that he'd never been good at archery anyway. There was Yusuf, who had lost his brother but saved a dozen others when he held a crucial position alone for 10 minutes. Each face, each story, each sacrifice, Khalid committed them all to memory. These men deserved to be remembered, to have their courage recognized not just in the grand sweep of history, but in the particular details of individual heroism. As midnight approached, Khalid stood alone once more at the cliff's edge where he had stood 2 days before. The position felt different now, marked by experience and loss. Below, he could see the distant lights of the Crusader camp, miles to the south, moving away like dying embers. Tomorrow they would be gone entirely, and the valley would return to silence. A young soldier named Hassan approached him, the same boy who had wept after his first kill. His hands had stopped shaking, but his eyes carried a new weight, the burden of having seen death up close. "Commander," Hassan asked quietly, his voice uncertain, "was it worth it? All those who died, all the blood and pain, was it worth it?" Khalid stood silently for a long time, looking up at the stars that seemed close enough to touch in the mountain air. He thought of Salma's letter over his heart, of the future she represented. He thought of the men they had buried today and the families who would grieve them. He thought of Al-Qamar's walls still standing and the children who would play in its streets tomorrow. "Ask me again when you see your sister's children playing in the streets of Al-Qamar. Ask me when you grow old in a city that still stands, when you watch your grandchildren learn to read in schools that weren't burned, when you see physicians and scholars and poets emerge from a culture that survived. Then I will tell you, yes, it was worth it. Every drop of blood, every moment of terror, every man we lost, because we stood when others would have run, because we fought not for conquest or glory, but for the simple right to exist, to protect what we loved, and because of that, our people live. That is worth everything." 3 weeks later, word reached the valley that Baron Geoffrey de Montclair had returned to Europe, his campaign abandoned, his reputation as an invincible commander shattered. The story of the Valley of Fear spread through both Christian and Muslim lands, interpreted differently by each side, but agreed upon in its essential facts. 1,000 men faced 5,000 and prevailed through courage, cunning, and intimate knowledge of their homeland. And in the mountain passes of Syria, fathers would tell their sons of the 1,000 who stood against 5,000, and won not through superior force, but through superior will. The story became legend, the legend became inspiration, and inspiration became the fuel for future generations who would face their own impossible odds. In Al-Qamar, Salma grew up to become a physician just as she had dreamed. She would live to 63, treating patients regardless of their faith or origin, and would write a medical treatise that would be studied for centuries. She never forgot that her life, her work, her very existence had been purchased by men who chose to stand in a narrow valley when wisdom might have suggested they run.
But what if Khalid had not known these mountains as intimately as he knew his own heartbeat? What if pride or desperation had driven him to meet the 5,000 in open battle, as honor might have demanded, as his men might have expected? The mathematics are brutal and unforgiving. In open terrain, 5,000 armored cavalry and infantry would have crushed 1,000 lightly armed defenders in perhaps 2 hours. The Crusader military machine was designed for exactly this kind of engagement, overwhelming force applied with disciplined precision. The Crusaders would have reached Al-Qamar within a week, their momentum building with victory. The city's walls, already weakened by age and neglect, crumbling in places from simple weather and time, would have fallen in days. Baron Geoffrey, true to his documented reputation, would have shown no mercy. History records what he did to other cities that resisted. The population of 15,000 would have faced slaughter or enslavement. The men of military age would have been killed. The women and children would have been taken as slaves or worse. The ancient libraries, containing centuries of accumulated scientific and mathematical knowledge, translations of Greek philosophers, original works on algebra and astronomy, medical texts that would not be matched in Europe for another 2 centuries, would have burned, as libraries always do in conquest. Khalid's family, his wife Amira, his daughter Salma, his young son Ibrahim, would have been among the casualties or prisoners. The genetic and intellectual line that would produce scholars, physicians, and poets in generations to come would have ended in fire and blood. Salma's medical treatise would never have been written. The patients she would save would have died. The students she would teach would have remained ignorant. And perhaps most significantly, the psychological message would have spread like wildfire through the region. Resistance is futile. Other cities, seeing Al-Qamar's fate, seeing that even determined resistance led only to annihilation, might have surrendered without a fight or simply fled before the Crusader advance. The balance of power in the entire region would have shifted. The cultural exchange, the preservation of knowledge, the development of civilization in that corner of the world would have taken a different path. The butterfly effect of that single battle, or rather the battle that didn't happen in the way it might have, ripples forward through time in ways we can scarcely imagine. How many scientific discoveries depended on those libraries surviving? How many lives were saved by physicians trained in traditions that might have been extinguished? How much poetry, music, art, and human beauty existed because one commander chose terrain over honor, patience over glory, survival over pride. But that is not what happened. 1,000 men stood in a valley. They used terrain and intelligence and courage. They transformed their weakness into strength and their enemy's strength into weakness. And in doing so, they changed not just their own fates, but the fate of generations unborn. The question remains for you, the viewer, the person reading these words or watching this screen. In your own life, when faced with impossible odds, do you seek the open field or the narrow pass? Do you fight on the enemy's terms or your own? Do you recognize that sometimes the bravest choice is not to meet force with force, but to transform the nature of the conflict itself? When you face your 5,000, whether it's an overwhelming obstacle, a seemingly unbeatable opponent, or circumstances that appear to doom you to failure, will you have the wisdom to find your valley, the creativity to turn the terrain to your advantage, the courage to stand when standing seems foolish? History remembers the 1,000 who stood at Wadi al-Khawf because they offer us something more valuable than a tale of military triumph. They offer us a template for how intelligence, determination, and intimate knowledge of your own ground can overcome brute force. What is your valley? What is your impossible battle? And how will you choose to fight it? Leave your thoughts below.